Today is Maundy Thursday, Holy Thursday, and that phrase Maundy Thursday has, it's a Latin phrase, and it has an English derivative, the word mandate. Nate actually just wrote a bit of a write-up on that. It was an excellent little introduction to the idea of it, and in there he pointed out that the mandate of Maundy Thursday comes actually out of John 13:34, that Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you would love each other as I have loved you." And we see this acted out. Jesus demonstrated this throughout his ministry, but there is a particularly poignant scene in the Last Supper that occurred on Thursday. This is part of what we are commemorating on this day. It was on Thursday that Jesus celebrated this Last Supper with his disciples. And in the course of the meal, before it actually, everyone was sitting around waiting to have their feet washed by a servant. It was a servant's job to wash the feet of the guests at this meal, and it was not just a servant's job, it was a job relegated to the least of the servants. And Jesus, as you well know, took up the basin and the towel and put a towel around his own waist and did that job. And afterwards, he said to his disciples, as you have seen me do, so now you do unto others. The idea, of course, being that we serve God by serving others. And part of how we love God is by loving others. It's this command, this mandate, this Maundy concept. But he shares the meal, and he and his disciples, the 11 disciples, Judas has already left, walked out into the darkness, John says, to enact his betrayal. And so he and the 11 disciples leave the upper room, and they go together to a place that was a favorite place of repose for Jesus. Judas knew that that's where Jesus would be, so Jesus frequented this place, and at one point it even says that this was his custom. And so they're going to this familiar place, the Mount of Olives. It's a garden. And it's an olive grove, and they grew olives, they grew figs, but it's known for its olives. And he goes into this garden, and actually they go in a little way, and he tells 8 of the disciples to wait there. And then he and James and John and Peter go a little way further, and then he tells those 3 to wait there, and Jesus goes in even further. And it says that they were in a portion of the garden called Gethsemane. A Gethsemane is an oil press. It's a large stone with pulleys and ropes, and they would pick the olives. They'd put the olives in kind of a cheesecloth material, and they would place this rock, and they would apply pressure to this large stone. And as they crushed these as they crushed these olives, the oil would flow out. And they're at this point. I know this is maybe some serendipity, some irony, but I also think it's illustrative of what is going on, that it's at this place in this olive grove, this Gethsemane, this press, where Jesus goes in by himself, essentially carrying the weight of what he is about to do all on his own shoulders. And it's almost like it's crushing him. The same way that Gethsemane would crush the olives, it's almost like he's being crushed under the weight. Now we read, I believe it's in Luke's gospel, that he sweat what appeared to be great drops of blood. You see, even in the garden, Jesus was beginning to shed his blood for us. And I believe it was the weight of what he was carrying crushing him and beginning to shed his own blood. We need to see the poignancy of that scene. None of these points need to be or should be lost on us as we come to this. Yet that's not what I want to deal with today. I want to deal with how inordinately human Jesus looks at this moment. Think back to the story of Jesus. He's been very divine, very in control over the wind and the waves, over the demons, over physical sickness, healings are occurring, over his teaching and the lessons he's giving, over the way he instructs his disciples, even over the timing of his own death. He's been very much in control. And we have no problems at this point recognizing the divinity of Christ. And we talk about the fact that he was both divine and human. I like what Martin Luther used to say, is that he didn't take one and replace it with the other. He actually added to his divinity humanity. And we talk about that, yet we're more comfortable, at least I'm more comfortable with the divinity of Jesus. And here we are, we're at the moments before his betrayal, we're at the moments before his trials, we're hours away from his crucifixion. The thing he came to do, the thing that God incarnated himself into humanity to accomplish, the very purpose he's here. We're at the point, and it's at this point, precisely at this point, that Jesus appears most human. I was thinking about this. Have you ever had someone that you look up to that always seemed to be a pillar of strength? My grandfather passed away some years ago, and my grandfather is kind of that for me, a bit of a hero in my life. My parents always used to say, "You're so much like your grandfather," and they never meant it as a compliment. My grandpa had some amazing qualities. He always saw the best in people. He never put anyone down. He was a phenomenal person. Yet he also had some idiosyncrasies, and it's interesting. Whenever my parents compared me to my grandfather, they were never comparing me to his best attributes. They were always comparing me to some of his lesser attributes, his impulsiveness, his always looking to the next thing, and his struggle with being content in the moment. But I remember I remember once in particular, I got to work all summer with him, and he was my hero. I looked up to him. He was solid. He was the kind of person I wanted to be. Nothing really ever seemed to rattle him, and he always just kind of rolled with it. But I remember coming back as a young adult to their house in Ottawa, Illinois, and it was right after his mother had died, and she had lived a good long life. 105, I think almost 106. I can't remember for sure. She lived a good long life. And I remember sitting around their dining room table. I was in one of the chairs. I actually have my grandfather's chair in my office. And so whenever I sit in that chair, I think of this moment. My grandfather's sitting in that chair that's now in my office that I sit in. And I remember this man that I looked up to. I remember him crying. I mean, she was old. We knew she was going to die, and we weren't really grieving. We were celebrating. She lived a godly life. She was an amazing woman, and we were celebrating, but I remember him crying. And he wept. And I had never seen my grandfather like that. I don't know if you've ever seen that, where the person that you look to for strength, for comfort, for getting you through the moment, who seems to always be in control. I don't know if you've ever experienced them weak, fragile, broken. And I think this is what troubles me about the garden scene. Jesus and his disciples walk in, and here he is at the moment that the precise moment that his divinity has brought him to dwell amongst us. And he doesn't appear more divine, he actually appears more human. I want to look at Mark's gospel on this, and you can find this in the synoptics as well. This is repeated, but he's gone in a little bit further with the three disciples, James, John, and Peter. And he says to them in verse 34, Mark 14, verse 34, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch." I was looking at some different translations on that verse. The King James Version says, "My soul is exceeding sorrowful unto death." The NAS says, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death." The NIV, I kind of like the NIV on this one. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." And he's asking his friends, stay here and keep watch with me. Here's what startles me about this, is at this point, we see Jesus appearing very human and very afraid. I was trying to think, and I went and searched throughout the Gospels. I was trying to think of another point at which Jesus showed fear. I couldn't find any. Maybe there's one in there. If you know of it, let me know. But here he is demonstrating fear. So human, so fragile, so frail, so broken, and he's on the cusp of the very thing that he came to do. And he seems so human. And I've been having troubles grappling with that. Like, what do I do with this? Because I've made this mistake of thinking, but he was God. Like this mistake of thinking, because he knew what he knew about resurrection, he knew the end of the story. And he tried to explain it to the disciples, and they wouldn't get it. And really, I don't think they could have. But he knew who he was, he knew what was going to happen, and he knew how it was going to come out. And somehow in my mind, I thought that knowing would change or made what he was going through as a human less real. And actually, just not too long ago, it dawned on me that his knowing is what made it more terrifying. Think about this for a moment. If you knew when you were going to die, you knew how you were going to die, and you knew it was going to be horrible, even if you didn't fear being dead, you'd be afraid of the dying because of what you know. And here Jesus knows. He knows there's crucifixion coming. And as a child, there was a series of crucifixions that happened just outside of his childhood home. So he would have been very familiar with the horror of this. So he knew crucifixion. He knew the humiliation. He knew the suffering. He knew the mocking. He knew all of this. He knew the forsakenness of his Father. And I think that is one of the most profound points of agony in his suffering here at the Gethsemane. He knew the weight of the sin. He knew what he was going to bear. And he was innocent. He knew all of these things. In fact, he's beginning to experience these things. The weight of them is crushing him. It says after he says to his disciples, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch." It says, and going a little further, he fell on the ground. In the Greek, it's almost like he threw himself on the ground. He collapses. His knees give way, and he is so burdened by this, and he collapses. It's all coming undone, and it's because he knows. And here's this thought that has just come into my mind that is just kind of wrecking my day is that his divinity, far from removing his humanity, actually kind of exemplifies it. Because of what he knows, because of the divinity and the knowledge that he has as the Son of God, because of all of that, it actually causes his humanity to rise. Now, it's not sinful. When we speak of humanity, we're not talking about some sinful aspect, but we're talking about this weakness and this frailty and this fragility and this fear. Jesus was afraid. And even as I say that, I'm wrestling with that as a concept that Jesus was afraid. But he was afraid because of what he knew. And so he prays to his Father, if it's possible, take this cup from me. God's answer to that prayer was no. You're going to have to walk through that. Of course, we know Jesus could have called the 10,000 angels or the legions upon legions of angels. He could have called them, and God would have instantly delivered him. But Jesus came as God to deliver us. And there was no other way. If it's possible, take this cup from me. This cup represented the sorrow and the suffering, everything that was about to happen. And he knew what was in that cup. And so God's answer to that prayer request was no. But then he said, but not my will, but thy will be done. Your will be done. And God said yes to that request. When Jesus prayed, not my will, but thy will be done, he was praying that on the cusp of God already having said no to taking the cup. If we're going to pray, thy will be done, we've got to be willing to allow God's will to be done. Even if God's will, even if we don't know it, or even if we do, even if God's will causes us fear, weakness, struggling, sorrow, falling on the ground with no other recourse. Even if God's will is that our humanness comes to the surface. You see, it's precisely at the point of Jesus' greatest display of humanity that he also displays the greatness of his divinity. I think of Paul writing in 2 Corinthians where he says that he has been plagued with a thorn in the flesh, something physical that was causing him great torment. And he prayed that God would take it. He prayed 3 times. I wonder if Paul was modeling his prayer on Jesus' prayer, because Jesus prayed this prayer 3 times. 3 times. Take this cup from me. And I wonder if Paul was praying that prayer 3 times as a model of what Jesus was doing. And he prayed that God would take the thorn from his flesh. And God's answer to him was no. Instead, he says, my grace is sufficient, for where you are weak, I am strong. You see, the moment of our greatest humanity is precisely the point at which God comes in with the greatness of his divinity. And the point of this is that at the greatest point of our weakness, God is most powerful to do what only he can do. So here today, think about this. You may be at your weakest. Maybe it's sickness. Did you know your sickness right now is your ministry? It's your ministry because it's your weakness. And what you do with that weakness is what's going to bring glory to God, because this is what Jesus does. Jesus doesn't walk through these trials in this profound strength. He begins these trials in profound weakness and profound humanity. And this is what you need to know. Like, if it's sickness, that is your ministry. That's your weakness. Maybe you're afraid of dying. I'm not afraid of being dead. I'm afraid of dying. Maybe that's it. That's your ministry. Because God's wanting to take that weakness and do something profound with it. Whatever it is, maybe it is despair. And maybe that is the weakness that you are enduring. It's because God's is getting ready to do something profound in your life. Whatever it is. Whatever it is. Jesus was overwhelmed to the point of death. He was very human. And he fell on his face and he prayed. And God didn't just instantly zap him and say, okay, here you go. It's going to be so much easier for you. No. Somehow God strengthened him in that. So that in this moment of humanity, when he was out of control, when it seems like it's all falling apart, in the greatest moment of his humanity, God begins to do the greatest thing for humanity.